The rooster crowed as the first light broke over the trees surrounding Tage village, a land cradled by hills and blessed with streams that whispered old stories. Among the woven mud huts and red earth paths, 17-year-old Nkem moved with the grace of someone used to being unseen, yet whose spirit made the leaves pause. She was not the loudest girl, nor the boldest. But in her silence, there was strength, a quiet defiance that made her presence feel like the steady beat of a drum beneath the surface. People noticed. Elders praised her humility, women admired her resolve, and children often followed her like chicks behind their mother, drawn to something warm in her gaze. Nkem's life had not always been shaped by shadows. Once, when her father was alive, there had been laughter in their compound. Her father, Uche, was a palm tapper with calloused hands and a laugh like thunder. He had cherished Nkem and taught her to climb trees, told her riddles by firelight, and made her feel like a gift. But everything changed the day he went into the forest and never came back. The men found his gourd smashed beside a root, his machete half buried in the soil, and no sign of his body. The villagers mourned. Some whispered of a spirit attack, others hinted at something darker. But the truth was swallowed by the wind, and Nkem's world shattered. Within months, her mother, Obi, remarried. She did not do so out of desire, but survival. Alone, with no sons and little family, Obi was easy prey for gossip and starvation. Ozuom, a widower with land and bitterness in equal measure, came like a rescuer and stayed like a plague. He was not kind. His voice was stone, his hand heavy, and his eyes always watching with suspicion. Nkem became the object of his cruelty, though never in ways spoken aloud. He made her scrub floors on her knees until they bled, eat after everyone else, and blamed her for things that broke or went missing. Obi tried to shield her daughter, but her strength had long been eroded by grief and fear. Then there was Chuka, Ozuom's son from a previous marriage. Only 2 years older than Nkem, Chuka had a face that could charm strangers but held venom behind his smile. Where Nkem was diligent, Chuka was lazy. Where she was respected, he was tolerated. And that galled him. He hated the way the villagers called her the wise girl, how the herbalist once said, that one carries her ancestors in her bones. His jealousy turned into coldness, then cruelty. He tripped her when no one watched, whispered lies into their father's ear, and spread rumors among the boys that she thought herself better than everyone. But the village saw through most of it. They still praised her. And that made Chuka boil. Their home was one of creaking walls and stomachs that growled. Poverty wrapped itself around them like a second skin. Obi tried to make ends meet selling okra and groundnut paste, while Ozuom drank away whatever coin came from selling his yams. Chuka, meanwhile, did nothing useful. He stole fowls from neighbors and traded them at the market for bottles of palm wine and handfuls of dried meat. He had debts in 3 villages and bruises from fights that never seemed to end. Then came the merchant. A tall man in a red cap, with eyes like a lizard and a tongue slicker than oil. He arrived with 2 donkeys and a cart full of goods, cowrie beads, smoked fish, dried pepper, trinkets from far-off places, and, most tempting of all, a sealed calabash of aged palm wine, said to be tapped from a sacred tree during an eclipse. The village buzzed with curiosity. The merchant claimed he traded in rare things, not for coin, but for what you can't find twice. Chickens, rare herbs, carved idols, and people. Not openly, of course. He never said the word slave. But everyone knew what he meant. Chuka's eyes locked on that bottle of palm wine like a dog eyeing meat. He imagined how it would taste, how it would make the village boys look at him with envy, how it would silence the laughter that always seemed to stop when he entered a room. He had nothing to trade. But then he looked at Nkem, crouched by the stream washing bitter leaf, her fingers raw but her face serene. And an idea, dark and thrilling, crept into his mind. That night, he stole herbs from the healer's hut, ones known to lull the body into deep sleep. He brewed them into a porridge and offered Nkem a bowl after a day's hard labor. "You've worked too hard," he said with an uncharacteristic grin. "Eat." Tired and starving, Nkem did. Within minutes, her world blurred and faded into darkness. Before dawn, Chuka wrapped her in a raffia mat, tied her hands, and dragged her to the merchant's cart under the cloak of fog. The merchant raised an eyebrow. "She looks healthy," he said, running a finger down Nkem's arm. "Strong." Chuka forced a laugh. "She's a disobedient slave girl my father wants gone. A burden." The merchant gave him the wine, a pouch of salt, and a few shiny trinkets. Chuka watched them drive away with Nkem's body bouncing in the cart, and for a moment, he felt powerful. By mid-morning, word spread that Nkem was gone. Chuka cried false tears and told everyone she had run off with a traveler. "A foolish girl," he said, shaking his head. "Shameful, really. She's always been secretive." Some believed him. Others didn't. But none dared question him openly. His father was quick with a machete, and their house was one of silent threats. Obiageli knew the truth. Not in words, but in her bones. She wept behind closed doors, cried to her ancestors, and held Nkem's wrapper like a shroud. But she had no power, no voice loud enough to rise above the grief. Her daughter was gone, her light stolen, and all she had left was the echo of her absence. Nkem vanished without a trace. No footprints. No farewell. Just the lingering scent of bitterleaf and the haunting emptiness where a girl once laughed. The first thing Nkem felt was the cold. Not the kind that kissed your skin, but the kind that seeped into your bones and reminded you that something was deeply wrong. Her eyelids fluttered open, heavy as stone, and she found herself staring at the cracked wooden ceiling of a moving cart. The world around her jolted and creaked as the wheels turned over rough terrain. Her arms ached. Her legs were twisted beneath her in an unnatural position. Then came the sound, metal clinking against wood. She looked down and saw the rusted shackles clamped around her ankles. Chains. Panic surged through her, but her limbs would not move as quickly as her mind. Her mouth was dry, her body weak. The air smelled of sweat, old spices, and fear. She blinked again and realized she wasn't alone. Two other girls sat beside her, silent, eyes wide and hollow. One of them had dried blood on her temple. Nkem tried to speak, but her voice cracked. It hit her like thunder. She had been sold. Her stepbrother had sold her like yam in the market. Like cattle. Tears welled in her eyes, but she swallowed them. Not here. Not in front of strangers. The sky above was fading into blue, and the cart passed fields she didn't recognize. They had traveled far. She didn't know where she was or what awaited her. But she knew this: she was no longer Nkem of Ntage. She was a prisoner. After 2 days of riding, through thick forests, past villages that stared but said nothing, and across wide rivers, they arrived at Abo. The city was unlike anything she had ever imagined. It breathed power, with its red clay walls, tall palm trees, and the scent of sea salt carried by the wind. There were ships at the port, massive wooden beasts with white sails, and people of every hue and tongue bustling in the marketplace. But there was no awe in Nkem's heart. Only dread. The cart stopped before a grand compound, guarded by men in red wrappers with carved wooden staffs. The driver handed a sealed letter to one of them, and without a word, Nkem and the other girls were dragged inside. The house was vast, its floors tiled with imported stone, its walls painted in bright colors, its ceilings high enough to swallow sound. And yet, it reeked of cruelty cloaked in wealth. A tall woman with gold rings on every finger inspected the girls like livestock. She paused before Nkem, fingers tilting her chin, eyes narrowing. "This one will serve in the main house," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Pretty, but too proud. We'll fix that." That was the beginning of Nkem's second life. They stripped her of her clothes, her necklace, even the anklet her mother had given her as a child. She was given a gray wrapper and no shoes. They refused to use her name. "You are Ada now," the woman snapped. "Your past is gone. You belong to the Omodu family." That night, she slept on a mat in a dark corner, too exhausted to cry, too broken to think. Her days became cycles of pain. Wake before dawn. Scrub the floors until her fingers bled. Cook food she wasn't allowed to eat. Fetch water, sweep courtyards, polish ornaments she could never touch. The other servants rarely spoke. Most were older, their eyes dulled by years of submission. The guards leered. One man, in particular, followed her with eyes that made her skin crawl. When he tried to grab her one afternoon, she fought back, bit his arm until he bled. She was whipped for it, 10 lashes across her back. But she didn't scream. She stared into the woman's eyes as the whip cracked. Silent. Defiant. In the shadows of the kitchen, an old voice whispered to her. "You have fire," the woman said. "But don't let it burn you before it becomes useful." It was Mama Itohan, the oldest servant in the house. Bent with age but sharp as a hawk. She worked in the herb room and watched everything, every glance, every order, every secret exchanged between the masters. Slowly, Mama Itohan took Nkem under her wing. At night, by lantern light, Mama Itohan taught her to read, first in Igbo, then slowly, in English. She taught her numbers, how to count coins, how to watch people's hands instead of their mouths. "Power," she said, "moves in silence. You must learn to see before others speak." Nkem soaked in every word. She learned how merchants lied with smiles, how mistresses kept secrets in perfume bottles, and how even the strongest walls had cracks if you knew where to press. But beneath all her learning, something else grew in her. A hatred that glowed like an ember, hidden beneath her calm. Every time she knelt to scrub floors, she saw Chuka's face. Every time she bore an insult in silence, she imagined returning, not as a girl, but as a storm that would break the sky. "I will go back," she whispered to herself each night, clutching her thin blanket. "I will return. And I will make them remember." In time, Nkem began saving. The coin that slipped from the mistress's pocket. The scrap of silver from a broken spoon. The bribe a merchant's boy gave her to deliver a message discreetly. Every coin was hidden beneath a loose stone in the herb room. Her treasure. Her future. Abo was a city of duality. Its markets sold silk and sorrow. Its alleys held secrets and screams. She saw girls younger than her sold to sailors. She saw old men beg for forgiveness with empty hands. But she also saw something else: wealth, knowledge, and strategy. She watched how the merchant family traded with foreigners, how they negotiated, how they bought loyalty. She listened. She memorized. One evening, as the sun died into the river and the compound glowed in amber light, Mama Itohan gave her a carved piece of wood. It was shaped like a bird with wings spread wide. "This is from my village," she said. "We call it Ogagoro, the fire bird. It cannot be caged." She paused, eyes narrowing. "Fire that is not quenched becomes a weapon. Become that weapon, Nkem. But strike only when the fire is ready." Nkem held the carving in her palm and felt something stir. Not just rage. Not just pain. But purpose. She had been shackled, stolen, and silenced. But she had not been broken. Not yet. She was watching. Learning. Planning. And one day, the fire in her eyes would burn through every chain ever wrapped around her. The years did not pass quietly, nor did they dull the edges of Nkem's fire. Instead, they honed her into something sharper, something dangerous. The girl who had once scrubbed floors in silence now moved through the compound with a calculating grace. She had mastered the art of invisibility, of listening without being noticed, of seeing what others did not. She was no longer just Nkem the servant, she had become a student of fire. By the time she turned 20, Nkem spoke 4 languages: Igbo, Yoruba, English, and a smattering of Portuguese picked up from drunken sailors and foreign traders who passed through Aboa's bustling port. She no longer only cleaned floors, she cleaned information. She gathered whispers and secrets like beads on a necklace, stringing them together into strategies. She had learned which captains were corrupt, which ships carried contraband, and which officials could be bribed. She studied the way traders negotiated, how they flattered chiefs, how they disguised lies with praise. The merchant's ledgers, once locked and guarded, were now something she could decode in her sleep. Every night, after the house quieted and the air cooled, she would sneak into the record room and read. Trade routes, taxes, names of allies and enemies, it all became hers. At first, she started small. A few jars of rare spices tucked into baskets, hidden under cassava and palm kernels. Handcrafted combs she carved with Mama Idohan's old tools, wrapped in banana leaves and sold to sailors' wives. Each item slipped unnoticed onto outgoing boats. The coin returned in whispers, folded into rags or left beneath pots by sympathetic guards. Her savings grew in secret, now buried in multiple hiding places across the city, under the floorboards of a spice shop, inside a hollow tree near the docks, and inside an old drum in Mama Idohan's herb room. To the world, she was still Ada, the servant with quiet eyes and lowered voice. But to a few in the underground market, she was Ada, a mysterious young woman from Arachukwa with rare goods, sharp wit, and no past. She wore a wrapper 2 shades too fine for a servant. Her voice, when she used it, carried weight. And slowly, her reputation grew. But just as the world opened for her, it began to close for Mama Idohan. It started with a cough, deep and wet, like something clinging to the old woman's lungs. Nkem tried every herb, every steam bath, every old remedy the markets could offer, but nothing worked. Mama Idohan's strength waned day by day, until she could barely sit up in bed. In her final days, she held Nkem's hand tightly and said, "You have become what I prayed for, not just free, but powerful." On the night she died, the rain fell like grief from the heavens. Nkem buried her in a quiet corner of the herb garden, where the earth smelled of mint and healing. Alone, under a tree heavy with night, she wept, not like a child, but like a woman who had lost her anchor. The next morning, she found a bundle hidden beneath Mama Idohan's mat. Inside it, a tightly folded pouch of cowries, gold dust, and silver rings, everything the old woman had saved. Alongside it lay a necklace woven with red and black stones, its pendant shaped like a rising flame. It shimmered faintly in the morning light. She remembered Mama Idohan's words, "This is for brave women. It protects them not from pain, but from becoming like the ones who caused it." With the old woman's blessing and legacy, Nkem made her move. A bitter trade dispute erupted in the merchant's household after a shipment was lost at sea. Chaos reigned as debts mounted and foreign partners threatened to withdraw. Nkem saw her chance. Using the knowledge she had gleaned over years, every clause, every loophole, every tactic, she presented herself to a visiting mediator as Ada, a small trader wrongfully indentured by the Omodu family due to an unpaid dowry. She backed her claim with forged documents, the merchant's own seal stolen months earlier, and a well-placed bribe. With the support of 2 witnesses she'd secretly paid, both former servants with grudges, her claim stood. The dispute mediator, eager to punish the Amadis and save face with foreign traders, granted her immediate release. And just like that, after 3 years of chains and silence, she walked out the compound gates, not as a runaway, not as a slave, but as a free woman with documents and dignity. She did not wander. She had a name now. Ada. A traitor. A storm wrapped in human skin. She met Salma at the river docks, a striking woman from the north, tall and always dressed in indigo cloth. Salma had heard of Adaura's smuggling skills and offered a partnership. "You have fire," she said. "I have wind. Let us make waves." Together, they built something neither could have done alone. Salma provided access to northern markets and camel routes. Nkem handled coastal trade and local deals. They transported kola nuts, gold dust, palm oil, spices, and carved ivory. Nkem used the profits to buy a boat, a sleek, fast craft with a painted eye on its prow. She named it Odiu Afuf, the wind's return. Within months, she had a small crew, loyal, paid well, and handpicked from the poor but sharp-eyed youth of Abo. They sailed from delta creeks to island markets, growing their network. Nkem rarely spoke of her past, but every night, she wore Mama Idohan's necklace beneath her wrapper. And every time she saw her reflection in the water, she reminded herself, the girl who once scrubbed floors had become a captain. Then one evening, as they anchored near Otucha, a trader approached with news. "Are you from Tage?" the man asked, eyeing her with curiosity. "They say the boy Chuka now rules your village like a warlord. They say he beats even the elders. Your mother, she's sick. Dying, they say." The words struck her like a blade. That night, Kim stood on the deck of her boat long after the others had gone to sleep. She stared at the moonlit river, heart heavy. For the first time in years, she wept, not for herself, but for her mother. The woman who had held her in storms. The woman who had lost everything when Kim vanished. She wiped her tears, her fingers trembling around the flame-shaped pendant. "This ends now," she whispered. The next morning, the crew found her already at the helm, dressed in white and red, eyes blazing. "We sail at dawn," she said. "Tentage." She did not speak of vengeance. She did not need to. There was iron in her voice. And fire in her eyes. The wind that stirred the dust at the edge of Tentage carried more than the scent of dry earth, it carried whispers. Whispers of a strange caravan approaching. Traders, yes, but too organized. Their guards too silent. Their leader too poised. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and a red cloak embroidered with gold thread. Her skin bore the tone of home, but her accent was foreign, her presence sharp. The people leaned from their huts, their eyes wary and curious as the caravan passed. At the head of the procession rode the noblewoman on a dark mare, her chin lifted, her face veiled. Beside her walked a tall, soft-spoken man with dreadlocks and a carved staff. He was said to be a healer from the east, a man called Ease, with herbs tied to his belt and strange prayers in his mouth. Behind them came wagons of cloth, beads, pots of palm oil, and crates stamped with strange symbols. The noblewoman asked to rent the abandoned palace hut on the hill, the one no one dared enter since the last chief died screaming in his sleep. She paid double the asking price, and gold gleamed as it changed hands. Within hours, children ran barefoot through the village screaming of her arrival. "The ghost woman has come," they cried. "She walks like a queen, but her eyes burn like the forest in dry season." And so it began. No one recognized her, not yet. The years in foreign garments had disguised the soft edges of girlhood. Now her jaw was firm, her eyes deep, and her silence heavy. She said little but observed everything. When elders came to greet her, she smiled slightly and offered them wine they dared not refuse. She spoke of trade routes, of bringing wealth to Tage, of sharing knowledge and medicine. They bowed and nodded, dazzled by her elegance, not realizing they bowed to a daughter of their own soil. Chuka, meanwhile, roamed the village like a wounded dog with a crown. Once lean and bitter, he had grown thick and mean. His breath smelled of palm wine and rotted teeth. He shouted at children and spat at elders. He boasted loudly about the girl he had once cast away like goat meat, saying she had begged him to keep her, but he'd sold her for peace. The villagers lowered their eyes and muttered, but no one dared speak openly. His fists were fast. His rants came like storms. He had become a man feared, not respected. One moonless night, long after the village lamps had dimmed, Kim slipped out of her rented hut and walked barefoot to the outskirts of town, her cloak drawn tight. Only Ease knew where she went. At a lonely hut near the stream, she knocked 3 times. The door creaked open slowly. And there stood Obi Ajili. For a heartbeat, silence ruled. Then, breath caught in lungs, tears-filled eyes, and time collapsed. Obi Ajili dropped to her knees. "My child." "Kim? Is it you?" Kim knelt beside her, clutching her frail mother. "Yes, Mama. I have returned." The embrace held years of agony, longing, shame, and unanswered prayers. Obi Ajili touched her daughter's face, her fingers trembling. "I prayed for death. I thought I lost you forever. What did they do to you?" "I survived," Kim whispered. "But I did not come back to weep, Mama. I came back for truth. For justice." Obi Ajili wept freely, her body shaking. "He lied. Chuka said you ran away. That you were a disgrace. I know. I heard. But no more lies, Mama. No more fear. The next morning, Kim walked barefoot to the sacred grove. The forest held its breath as she stepped through its ancient veil of mist. Alone, wrapped in silence, she knelt before the ancestral stones. She lit a bowl of camwood paste and herbs, then chanted the old names, her father's, her grandmother's, the ones her mother taught her before the world went dark. The fire crackled and shadows twisted, and when the smoke reached her eyes, the visions came. She saw herself in flames, but they did not burn her. They crowned her. She saw girls in chains, and her hands breaking those chains. She saw Chuka screaming, consumed by the fire of his own greed. And then she heard the voices of her ancestors, "You have returned not to remember pain, but to become its ending." From that day, the village began to change. Strange things started happening. Elders once loyal to Chuka began switching allegiances. Lands thought owned were suddenly questioned. Forgotten debts were called upon. Hidden documents revealed that Obiageli had never truly signed away her land, it had been forged. And somehow, this foreign noblewoman had copies of the original deeds. She began buying land at the village's edges. A palm wine supplier from across the river began refusing to sell to Chuka, claiming the noblewoman's coin is purer. Then came the day a sick child was healed by Isa's herbs, after all else had failed. The people whispered that his potions came from the spirits. That the noblewoman's hands had rubbed the boy's feet and whispered prayers before the fever broke. Mothers began sending gifts, yam, chickens, woven cloth. Not to Chuka. To her. Chuka grew restless, drunker. He beat his housegirl so badly one morning that even the elders turned away in shame. He ranted that a demon had returned in Tage. That the noblewoman was cursed. But his words fell flat. At dusk, a boy ran through the village with a basket of kola nuts in a red envelope. It was a summons. The noblewoman invited the village council to a feast at her palace hut. Even Chuka received one. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, she prepared. She wore the red cloak again. Not to hide, but to declare. The fire in her eyes glowed. She had built power with patience. Dug her roots deep in silence. And now, the soil of Tage trembled beneath her. She would not scream. She would not beg. She would not curse him. But she would show him what a souled girl becomes when she returns. Not with shame, but with fire. The sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the village square as aromas of roasted meat, pepper soup, and steaming yam filled the air. Brightly dressed drummers arrived with carved instruments, their rhythms echoing into the hills. Palm wine flowed freely, tapped fresh from the tree and brought in gourds the size of a child's head. The villagers, confused yet delighted, gathered in numbers they hadn't seen since the last coronation feast. Word had spread fast. A noblewoman had returned wealth in Tage, and now she was throwing a feast for every man, woman, and child. No payment required. No strings. Just food, drink, music, and laughter. But behind the joy lay an undercurrent of mystery. Why now? And what did she want? Chiefs arrived first, carried in hammocks, their wrappers bright, their eyes sharp. Women came in beaded braids and embroidered blouses. Children chased each other between tables, too excited to eat. Even elders who hadn't left their compounds in years came leaning on walking sticks. At the center of it all stood the palace hut, once abandoned, now restored, with silk curtains billowing from its windows and guards posted at each door. And then, he arrived, Chuka. Drunk. Swaggering. Wearing his finest red wrapper with a leopard tooth around his neck, as if mocking royalty. He held a gourd of palm wine in one hand, his eyes scanning the crowd for trouble. "Let them serve me," he bellowed. "It was I who kept this village in order when cowards fled." No one answered. He frowned, unease creeping in. Just then, a hush fell over the gathering. From behind the palace hut, she emerged. Unveiled. Unmasked. unapologetic. Kim walked into the light wearing a red blouse with gold trim, her shoulders squared, her eyes unblinking. Her face, the same face villagers had once known in childhood, now held the serenity of someone who had walked through fire and returned without ash. Her neck bore Mama Idohan's sacred necklace. Her wrists glinted with ivory bangles. But it was her expression, calm and terrible in its steadiness, that froze every tongue. Gasps rose from the crowd. That's her. Kim? Is it possible? Chuka's gourd slipped from his hand and shattered on the ground. I am Kim, she said, her voice smooth as silk and sharp as a blade. Daughter of Obiagili. Daughter of this soil. And I have returned. She stepped onto the wooden platform built at the square's center. The drums silenced. Even the breeze seemed to pause. I was sold, she continued. Like meat in the market. Like a burden to be discarded. I was stolen in my sleep, chained like an animal, and dragged to the coast like a curse. She raised her blouse slightly. A silver scar, thin but unmistakable, cut across her ribs. This is where the shackles bit into my skin. Murmurs became cries. Old women covered their mouths. Men glanced at each other with guilt. The truth fell over the gathering like a blade. She pointed. He sold me. Chuka staggered backward. Lies. She's mad. You all know she ran away. She ran with a foreigner out of shame. Before he could finish, Kim raised her hand. A tall man stepped forward, a familiar face to a few elders. The traveling merchant, aged and humbled, now bearing a rope around his waist and a document in his hand. She speaks truth, he said hoarsely. Years ago, I bought her for a bottle of aged palm wine, and a few copper trinkets. This man claimed she was his slave. She was not. And his voice cracked, I was wrong. I have paid the price. I am now her servant until my debts are clear. He bowed low before Nkem and presented the document. Gasps exploded from every corner. The chiefs turned to Chuka. You did this? The oracle's keeper stepped forward, a small woman cloaked in blue, her face painted in white clay. This matter must be judged before the gods, she said. Ozuom, silent all this while, lowered her head and whispered, he is guilty. The crowd closed in on Chuka. No longer fearing his fists, they seized him by his arms and dragged him across the square. His screams echoed as he kicked, but it was no use. He was dragged like the beast he had become. Before the village shrine, beneath the great Irako tree, the oracle emerged, a blind man wrapped in feathers, his eyes milky, his voice like thunder. Speak, the oracle commanded. Nkem stepped forward. He sold me. Lied about it. Profited. And silenced my mother with his violence. The oracle raised his hand. You who was sold, have you taken blood and vengeance? No, Nkem replied. Only truth. Then the ancestors have walked with you. He turned to Chuka, who now wept like a child. You were given the care of a sister and chose to sell her for wine. You disgraced your family. You shamed the gods. Your punishment is banishment. The crowd gasped. Chuka wailed. You will leave Ntage before the next full moon, the oracle decreed. And never return. Your name shall be wiped from family records. The land shall not remember you. He struggled, begged. But the people turned their backs. Even the children who once feared him now threw leaves and dust at his feet. And then, Nkem uncorked a small bottle from beneath her robe. The bottle. Old. Dusty. The exact bottle of aged palm wine he had sold her for. She walked to the center of the square and poured it slowly onto the earth. The scent of fermented sweetness filled the air. This, she said coldly, is your price. The wine soaked the dust, seeping into the roots of the village. May it haunt your throat forever, she whispered. And turned away, never looking back. The air of Ntage changed in the weeks following Chuka's banishment. Where once there had been silence in the face of violence, there now rose laughter, purpose, and something long forgotten, hope. It began quietly, like embers catching on dried grass. Then it grew into flame. Nkem took the momentum of her reckoning and shaped it into revolution. She named her vision the fire market, a place where no one would ever again be sold, silenced, or used. It began as a gathering beneath a large silk canopy she had imported from the coast. Women came shyly at first, curious, unsure. But what they found was more than trade. It was safety. It was knowledge. It was power, quietly returned to the hands that had long been forced to tremble. The fire market was more than stalls and goods. It was a sanctuary. There were 3 pillars: learning, labor, and liberation. Girls who had been beaten, shamed, or overlooked now sat in shaded huts and learned to read the language of contracts, to count coins, to debate, to ask why and not just how much. They learned how to trade cola nuts and pepper, yes, but also how to speak with elders, navigate taxes, and manage land. They learned that a woman's mind was not a danger, but a weapon, and one that could protect instead of wound. Nkem stood at the heart of it all, not as a queen, but as a living flame. Her lessons were not always spoken, they were lived. She swept floors beside girls. She sat with weeping mothers. She brokered trade deals that brought prosperity without exploitation. And she taught every woman who walked through the fire market gates that dignity was not something to be given, it was to be reclaimed. Soon, songs began to rise in the evening. Small, then swelling. The daughter who burned back, the girls sang. The one who walked in chains and returned in gold. Mothers began naming their newborn daughters Nkem, in her honor. Drummers composed chants. Even the village drunkards, those who once drank beside Chuka, now whispered her name with caution and awe. Her childhood home, once a place of screams and shadows, was reborn. Nkem tore down the old walls and built anew. She replaced Ozuom's cursed silence with bookshelves, warm lamps, and laughter. What had been a chamber of fear became a hall of healing. It held a library, a kitchen that never closed, and beds for girls with nowhere else to go. She did not mourn Ozuom when she passed. Ozuom had died quietly, in the dark, her heart weighed by regrets never spoken. Her last days were marked by frail whispers no one heard. Nkem paid for her burial, but sent no tears. The dead could rest, but the living had work to do. Still, some men in the village pushed back. They scoffed at the fire market, calling it witchcraft or rebellion. They warned that a woman's place was being forgotten. But their protests fell flat in the face of progress. The girls they dismissed became wealthy traders. The women they mocked negotiated better grain prices than they ever could. And when they sought to sabotage or intimidate, they found themselves confronted not with rage, but with wisdom and alliances. Ease, the mysterious herbalist who had returned with Nkem, became her closest advisor. His knowledge of plants and spirit paths was unmatched. But more than that, he believed in Nkem's cause completely. He helped her not just heal wounds, but build bridges. Together, they reached out to neighboring villages, offering safe trade, medical help, and dispute resolution. Some scoffed, until they saw the profits and peace Nkem brought. Then they begged to be included. New crops were introduced, quinoa from the coast, drought-resistant yam from the north. Nkem taught families how to grow more with less, how to save seed, how to preserve. She invited foreign traders, but on her terms. Her routes were safe, guarded by trusted allies, some of them reformed outlaws who now served as protectors of the fire market. Girls who once hid their bruises now sat in council meetings. Mothers who once despaired now ran stalls that rivaled chiefs in wealth. The land of Ntage, once cracked and weary, began to bloom. Nkem's name spread beyond the river, beyond the hills. She was feared, but mostly, she was respected. She did not smile often, but when she did, it was with a warmth that melted fear. Her eyes still held shadows, but they were the kind that warned, "I have seen darkness, and I am not afraid of yours." One market day, as the sun burned low and the drums throbbed like heartbeat, she climbed a stone platform before the people. Men, women, and children gathered in silence. I was once sold, she said. Not for cattle. Not even for gold. But for palm wine. I was not the first. She paused, letting the truth settle over them like dust. I swore then, she continued, that no girl would walk through that fire again unless she chose to. She raised her hand, showing the sacred necklace Mama Itohan had left her. No girl from this village, she declared, her voice steady as rain on metal, will be sold for wine, goats, or shame again. Never again. The crowd erupted, not just in cheer, but in agreement. It was not just her promise now, it was theirs. And so the fire market blazed on, not just in Tage, but in every heart that had once been taught to bow. Nkem did not just rebuild a village. She rewrote its story. The village of Tage no longer whispered, it roared, with commerce, with education, with voices once silenced and now soaring. Along the footpaths, you could hear laughter uncoiled like bright thread. Girls carried baskets not just of yams, but of books. The marketplace shimmered with bright fabrics, clever bartering, and songs that told old stories in new tongues. From this new world emerged a generation unlike any before it, girls raised on the ashes of silence, girls who walked boldly into the spaces their mothers once feared to enter. They spoke multiple languages, debated with elders, and held their heads high without permission. They were the daughters of the fire market. Daughters of Nkem. And yet, Nkem, now older, her braids streaked with gray, remained as she had always been, watchful, purposeful, never one for crowns. When the council of elders approached her with a carved staff and the title of Chief of Renewal, she stood in silence for a long while. Then she shook her head. I do not want to rule, she said, her voice as steady as it had been the day she faced her village in judgment. Let the next girl lead. Let my fire light the path, but not block it. So it was that Ifeanyi, her pupil, once a stammering child who feared her own name, stood before the village under the red sun and became the first girl elected to village leadership. Her voice rang strong as she pledged not to lead from a throne, but from beside her people. Nkem watched from the shadows of the gathering, her arms crossed, a small, satisfied smile playing at the edge of her lips. This, she thought, is the harvest of pain that did not go to waste. To commemorate the fire that changed everything, the villagers began an annual celebration, the Night of Firelight. Each year, on the night of the red moon, girls gathered by the great hearth in the center of the fire market. There, they recited Nkem's story aloud, each part told by a different voice, from the betrayal to the chains, from the return to the reckoning. Lanterns shaped like flames lit the sky, and families came from miles around to watch. But one year, during the 12th night of firelight, a stranger crept into the village. Hunched, dust-covered, and barely able to walk, he waited until the stories were being told. He staggered toward the gathering, eyes hollow, hair in matted clumps. It was Chuka. Few recognized him at first. Time had carved him into a creature barely human. But when he spoke, raspy and broken, gasps echoed through the firelight. I have come to ask forgiveness, he said, his knees trembling as he bowed low. I was blind. I was cruel. Please. The fire crackled. Girls pulled their shawls tighter. Elders stood, unsure. Nkem rose slowly from her seat beside the fire. She walked to him. She looked once into his face, just once. And then she turned her back. She said nothing. That silence cut deeper than 1,000 curses. No one spoke as Chuka fell to his knees, sobbing. But no hand reached for him. He crawled from the firelight, into the waiting dark. By morning, he was gone. Some said he walked into the forest. Some said he became a ghost, doomed to wander. No one ever saw him again. The firelight flickered, and the gathering resumed. Life always resumes after reckoning. Later that night, as embers glowed low and stars blinked over the village, a small girl crept up to Nkem. She had been quiet all evening, clutching a leather-bound notebook she had made in the fire market school. Ma Nkem, she whispered. What gave you strength? When they sold you, when they hurt you, what made you keep living? Nkem's gaze softened. She leaned closer to the girl, cupped the child's chin in her hand, and said, being burned, and choosing not to turn to ash. The girl blinked, as if memorizing the words like scripture. Pain will come, Nkem said gently. But fire doesn't only destroy. It can clear the land. Make way for something bold. Something beautiful. But only if you don't let it become your master. Then she opened her palm and revealed the sacred necklace Mama Itohan had left her. The child stared in awe. This protected me, Nkem said. Not because it's magic. But because it reminded me I come from a long line of brave women who chose to rise, not with vengeance, but with vision. The girl nodded solemnly. As the fire died and the crowd drifted off to sleep, Nkem stood alone a moment longer beneath the stars. She thought of Mama Itohan, of her mother, of the silent women who had endured and never seen their day. She had been shackled, yes. Betrayed, yes. But in the end, she had not just survived, she had changed the story. And stories, she knew, were fire, too. Once told, they could never be untold. They could light futures. That night, girls all over Ntage dreamed of fire, not the kind that devours, but the kind that forges. And at the center of it stood Nkem. Not a queen. Not a chief. But a spark that lit 1,000 others. Nkem stood on the edge of the river, the familiar scent of the earth and water filling her lungs. The years had worn away some of the fire that had once burned so fiercely inside her, but not all. She still remembered the days when this river had been her only confidant, her prayers whispered into its currents as she asked for strength to survive the pain of betrayal. Now, as she looked at the water that had witnessed her transformation from the helpless girl sold for a bottle of palm wine to the powerful woman who had rewritten the rules of Ntage, there was only triumph. Her hands trembled slightly as she uncorked the bottle of aged palm wine she had earned, not sold for. She lifted it high, the cool liquid sloshing gently, the stars above mirrored in its dark depths. For a moment, she thought of her mother, Obiagili, of Mama Itohan, and the countless women who had taught her what it meant to rise after being knocked down. They were all here with her, in the sacred grove, in the river's flow, in the fire she had once kindled. This is for us, Nkem whispered. She tipped the bottle, watching the amber liquid disappear into the water, mingling with the current as though it was finally returning home. Not in sorrow, not in revenge, but in victory. As she turned away from the river, she felt a deep satisfaction, but it wasn't from the past, it was from what had come after. She had never been a ruler, never wanted power, yet the power had come to her, through the strength of her resilience, her ability to rise each time she was brought low. She had built something far more precious than any throne or title, she had built a legacy. The scrolls were already circulating across the region, her story captured in ink and parchment, passed from one hand to another in village schools. The young girls who read her words were not just inspired, they were changed. They saw themselves in her struggles, in her victories, and most importantly, in her refusal to be extinguished. Now, in her 40s, Nkem had become something more than a figurehead. She was a mentor, a guide, a teacher. Dozens of young women sought her counsel, some from neighboring villages, others from kingdoms far beyond the horizon. They came with wide eyes, eager to learn, not just the art of trade or survival, but how to carry their strength with dignity and grace. Nkem shared everything, her mistakes, her triumphs, her scars. She taught them how to rise with wisdom and how to burn away the rot that clung to their lives. She smiled as one young girl, a bright-eyed orphan from the next village over, presented her with a new scroll. The girl had written her own story, one that began with loss but would end with strength. Nkem nodded approvingly, then whispered, "Your fire is just beginning." The day came when Nkem knew it was time to step away from public leadership. She had done what she set out to do. The village no longer needed her to light the way, it had learned how to kindle its own flames. But the people of Ntage, of all the surrounding villages, refused to let her go without a tribute. They held a ceremony, one that echoed across the land, in which they honored her by placing a carved flame statue at the heart of the village square. Nkem stood before it, her heart heavy with gratitude. She never sought glory, yet the village had honored her in a way that no crown or title ever could. She was not just a symbol of strength, she was the fire itself. The day after the ceremony, Nkem sat by the fire in her compound, the flames flickering in the night. It was quieter now, the hustle of the village softer around her. She thought of the years, the challenges, the pain that had forged her. She had built something greater than herself, and she knew that she had done all she could for the village, for the girls, for her own healing. It was in this silence that a young girl walked past the fire. She was no older than Nkem had been when her life had been torn apart. The girl paused when she saw Nkem, her eyes wide with reverence. "You're the woman who set the village on fire," the girl said, awe and curiosity in her voice. Nkem smiled, her gaze softening. It was not the first time she had heard the phrase, but it was the first time she truly understood its meaning. She had indeed set the village on fire, but not in the way they had all thought. She hadn't burned it down, she had set it aflame with hope, with wisdom, with the kind of strength that couldn't be extinguished by time or cruelty. "No," Nkem replied, her voice gentle but steady. "I just reminded them how to burn away the rot." The girl nodded slowly, then disappeared into the night, her silhouette fading into the warmth of the village. Nkem stayed there by the fire, watching the embers dance in the dark. The fire had always been her companion, and tonight it felt like a close friend, one who knew her deepest secrets and her wildest dreams. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the distant echo of drums, drums that had been part of the village's heartbeat for generations. As the camera pulled back, the flames of Nkem's fire reflected in the torchlight that now lit every corner of Ntage. The village was alive, the fire she had planted long ago flickering in the hearts of the people. It was a fire that would never burn out, because it was no longer hers alone. It belonged to every woman, every child, every soul who had learned to rise from the ashes. The drums beat louder in the distance, the night humming with a quiet, unbreakable strength. And Nkem, the girl who had become the flame, sat by her fire, content at last.